Listen close now, children. Pull your chairs near. Bring that old wooden crate, settle on that worn log. Let the night wind blow soft through the bent trees. 'Cause what I got to tell ain't no small story, ain't no light memory. This here's memory that aches in the bone, burns in the skin, and pounds in the soul of those who inherited scars without ever taking the lash. This memory comes from times when the sun rose over fields that weren't ours, yet still our people planted, harvested, and bled to fill the pockets of men who claimed to own everything, even our very tears. Tonight I'm gonna tell you about Madison of the Barbed-Wire Whip, the man who knew hell by the lash and, even broken, made hell itself tremble when he decided to rise up. Yes, prepare yourselves, my people. 'Cause speaking of Madison is speaking of pure resistance, the kind born where hope don't exist no more. It's speaking of a body turned into a map of scars that still found its way to vengeance. It's speaking of a man marked by 800 lashes of barbed wire, each one tearing flesh like it wanted to rip out his very soul. But ancestral soul don't get torn out so easy. In the deep swamplands of South Carolina, where cypress trees hang heavy with Spanish moss like hanged ghosts, there lived a conjure woman named Althea who knew the power of roots and could call rain with her prayers. And it was there, in a cabin that creaked with the wind but held firm to hope, that Madison first drew breath into this suffering world. The old ones say that when a child is born under a blood moon, the ancestors mark that soul for something mighty, whether for great suffering or great power, only time tells. Madison came into this world on such a night, 18 and 32 years past, when the moon hung red as fresh spilled blood over the quarters, and the hound dogs howled like they seen the devil himself walking through the cotton rows. His mama, Althea, was woman of iron hands and a voice that could soothe the deepest pain when nights stretched too long. She birthed that boy with her own strong will. No white doctor touching her child, no overseer knowing the exact hour. That birth belonged to the quarters, to the people, to the old ways that survived even in chains. This child, whispered old Jeremiah, the root doctor who caught Madison in his weathered hands, this child gonna know suffering, but he gonna know power too. Look at them hands, already strong enough to grip a man's finger. Althea looked down at her son, still slicked with birth blood, and saw in his eyes something that made her heart heavy and proud at the same time. Even as a newborn, Madison didn't cry loud. He watched, studied, like he was already learning the ways of a world that would try to break him. The plantations stretched endless under Master Beauregard's rule, but it was Overseer Griggs who made life hell for the field hands. That man had eyes like a snake and a heart blacker than the bottom of a slave ship. Even the house servants crossed themselves when his name got spoken. Madison grew up in them quarters hearing the work songs that carried messages, the spirituals that held prayers too dangerous to speak out loud, and the whispered stories of those who tried to run north. His mama would sing to him about the drinking gourd in the sky and the underground railroad that carried souls to freedom, but always in code, always careful. Remember, son, Althea would tell him as she rubbed goose grease on his growing muscles, strength in a black man's body is like fire in dry grass. It draws attention fast, and attention from white folk ain't never good attention. But Madison was growing strong anyway, whether he wanted to or not. By age 12, he could lift cotton bales that took 2 grown men to carry. By 15, his shoulders were broad as a barn door, and his hands could split kindling with no axe needed. The white folk started noticing, and in them days, when white folk noticed a strong black man, it meant trouble was coming sure as sunrise. Lord have mercy, but that boy's strength grew like river water in spring flood. Fast, powerful, and impossible to contain. By the time Madison reached his 20th year, wasn't no task too heavy. No load too burdensome for them shoulders that looked like they'd been carved from oak hardwood. Master Beauregard himself would point Madison out to visiting plantation owners, bragging like he'd bred the finest stallion in all South Carolina. "Look at that buck," he'd say, chewing on his tobacco and spitting brown juice into the dirt. "Strong as 3 men, gentle as a lamb. Good breeding stock, yes, sir." But it was Overseer Griggs who watched Madison with different eyes. eyes full of suspicion and growing hate. That snake-hearted man knew the difference between strength that serves and strength that threatens, and something in Madison's quiet way of moving through the world set Griggs's teeth on edge. "That boy's got uppity in his bones," Griggs would mutter to the other overseers during their whiskey-soaked evenings on the big house porch. "Mark my words, he's trouble waiting to happen." Madison kept his head down and his mouth shut, but his mama Althea could see the fire building behind his eyes. She'd catch him sometimes, staring off toward the North Star with a look that made her heart clench with fear and pride both. "Son," she'd warn him, "a bent tree survives the storm, but a proud tree gets struck by lightning. But some trees are meant to stand tall no matter what storm comes, and Madison was that kind of tree, the kind that would rather break than bow. The other field hands loved him 'cause he'd share his water when theirs ran out, carry extra weight when someone was hurting, and never spoke harsh words even when the sun was beaten down merciless and the cotton rows seemed to stretch into eternity. The house servants respected him 'cause he knew how to read the white folks' moods and warn others when trouble was brewing. But it was the children who truly claimed Madison's heart. Little Ruby, no more than 12 years with pigtails that bounced when she ran, would follow him through the quarters like a baby duck follows its mama. She'd lost her own daddy to the auction block 2 summers past, sold off to a rice plantation down in the low country, and Madison had taken to watching over her like she was his own bloodkin. Uncle Madison, she'd call him, though they shared no blood except the shared blood of suffering. "Tell me about the North Star again. Tell me about the place where folks ain't got chains." And Madison would look down at that child's bright eyes, still holding hope despite everything she'd seen, and something fierce would stir in his chest, something that scared him with its power. One evening, as the last light of day painted the cotton fields gold and crimson, Madison was carrying water buckets from the well when he heard Ruby's voice crying out sharp and frightened from behind the overseer's shed. He dropped them buckets without a second thought and ran. Suffering so bad. That's what we all felt when Madison rounded that shed corner and saw Overseer Griggs with his hands on little Ruby, that child backed against the wooden wall with terror written across her face like words burned into bark. "Please, sir," Ruby was whispering, her voice small as a bird's wing in a hurricane. "I wasn't stealing nothing. I swear 'fore God. I was just looking for the eggs like Mama Celia told me to." But Griggs had that evil smile spread across his pale face, the kind of smile that don't reach the eyes, the kind that promises nothing but pain. His hands were already unfastening his belt, and the late sun caught the brass buckle like it was flashing a warning signal to anyone with eyes to see. "Little gal like you needs to learn proper respect for white men," Griggs was saying, his voice thick as molasses and twice as sticky. "Gonna teach you real good how to mind your betters." That's when Madison stepped into that space between evil and innocence, his body moving before his mind could catch up to warn him of the consequences. He didn't say nothing at first, just placed himself solid as a mountain between the overseer and that frightened child. Griggs looked up, his hand frozen on that belt buckle, and for a moment something like surprise flickered across his features. Then it hardened into the kind of rage that makes men do terrible things. "Boy, you better step aside for I—" "No, sir." Madison's voice came out quiet but steady as bedrock. "This child ain't done nothing wrong. Lord have mercy." The silence that followed them words was thick as blood pudding. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath, and the wind stopped rustling through the cotton plants like nature itself was afraid to move. Ruby slipped around behind Madison's broad back, her little hands clutching at his shirt like it was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. And maybe it was. Griggs's face went red as fresh spilled blood, and his hands started shaking, not with fear, but with fury that had been building for years like water behind a dam. Here was a slave, a piece of property, telling him no, telling him what he could and couldn't do with another piece of property. "You uppity black bastard," Griggs hissed, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "You think you can tell me my business? You think you're something more than the animal you are?" Madison kept his eyes down, knowing that looking direct at a white man could mean death. but his body stayed planted between Griggs and Ruby like a oak tree that's weathered 100 storms. "Just asking you to let the child go, sir. She ain't but 12 years old." That's when Griggs drew back his fist and struck Madison across the jaw with all the hate he'd been nurturing for months. The sound cracked through the evening air like a rifle shot, and Madison's head snapped to the side, blood spilling from his split lip. But he didn't fall, didn't step back, didn't move a blessed inch. And that's when Griggs knew he had a problem bigger than just one disobedient slave. He had a symbol standing before him, a living reminder that not every black soul could be broken into complete submission. He had a dangerous example that other slaves might start following. "Run, Ruby," Madison said soft, not taking his eyes off Griggs. "Run home to your mama." The child hesitated, torn between safety and loyalty, but Madison's voice carried command that couldn't be disobeyed. She ran, her bare feet slapping against the hard-packed earth, disappearing into the gathering darkness of the quarters. Griggs watched her go, then turned his full attention back to Madison, and the smile that spread across his face was like death personified. "You just signed your own death warrant, boy. You just made the biggest mistake of your short, miserable life." Madison finally raised his eyes and met Griggs's gaze straight on, and in that moment something passed between them that was older than slavery, older than America itself. It was the eternal struggle between power and resistance, between oppression and the human spirit that refuses to be completely crushed. "Maybe so, sir," Madison said, his voice still quiet but carrying weight like thunder rolling in from distant hills. "But I'd rather die standing than live crawling." And right then, watching Griggs's face twist with murderous rage, Madison knew his fate was sealed. But he also knew something else. Something that made his heart beat steady despite the terror surrounding him like a black cloud. He knew he'd done right by that child. He knew his ancestors were watching, and he knew that some things in this world are worth dying for, even if you're already living as less than human in the eyes of those who claim to own you. The reckoning was coming, and Madison was ready to meet it head on. Sweet Jesus, what came next ain't something the human heart wants to remember. But remembering is what we do, 'cause forgetting is the same as letting them devils win all over again. Word spread through the quarters like wildfire in dry grass. Madison Dunn stood up to Overseer Griggs. Madison Dunn looked a white man in the eye and said no. By morning, every soul on that plantation knew that Judgment Day was coming, and it was gonna be terrible to behold. Griggs didn't waste no time neither. Before the rooster could crow twice, he was stomping up to the big house, his boots heavy on them wooden steps like thunder announcing a storm. Master Beauregard was sipping his coffee from fine china, probably imported from some place across the ocean where folks didn't know the taste of blood mixed with their morning meal. "That boy Madison," Griggs said without even a good morning, his voice shaking with rage that had been festering all night like an infected wound. "He put his hands on me, struck me down like I was some common field hand. Now that was a lie black as the devil's own heart. But Master Beauregard's face went hard as stone anyway. In them days, a black man raising his hand to a white man, even in a lie, was worse than murder. It was revolution. It was the end of the world as they knew it." "You sure about this, Griggs?" Master Beauregard asked, but his tone said he already believed every word. "That boy's been nothing but obedient since the day he was born. Saw it with my own 2 eyes, sir. Knocked me clean to the ground when I was disciplining that little pickaninny Ruby for stealing eggs. Got uppity ideas about protecting that child, like she was his own blood or something. The lies came easy as breathing to men like Griggs, but the truth had a way of hiding in the shadows, waiting for its time. By noon, every slave on the plantation was gathered in the central yard, called from field and kitchen, barn and garden. The white folks lined up on the big house porch like they was watching some kind of entertainment, the ladies with their fans fluttering and their faces pale but curious. In the center of it all stood the whipping post, that cursed piece of wood that had drunk more black blood than a vampire. It was carved from an oak tree that must have been ancient when the first ship brought our people across the waters, and the trunk was smooth from the bodies that had been pressed against it. scarred with the marks of iron shackles and stained dark with suffering. Madison was dragged out between 4 white men, his hands already bound with rope thick enough to hold a bull. But even chained, he walked with his back straight, his head high like he was walking to his coronation instead of his crucifixion. Old Jeremiah, the root doctor, started humming low under his breath, one of them ancient songs that came from Africa, before the ships, before the chains, before the sorrow. Other voices joined in, soft at first, then growing like a river gathering strength. "Silence!" Griggs roared, his face red with fury and something else, something that might have been fear. "Any nigger that makes a sound gets 50 lashes himself." The humming stopped, but the spirit that carried it didn't die. It just went underground, flowing through the crowd like an invisible current, connecting every heart that beat with African rhythm to every other. Griggs walked slow around Madison, enjoying the moment like a cat playing with a mouse. In his hand, he carried something that made even the bravest souls gasp with terror, a whip unlike any they'd ever seen. It wasn't made of leather like the ones that had torn their backs 1,000 times before. This whip was made of barbed wire, 3 strands of it, twisted together like a metal rope, with points sharp enough to catch on bone. The handle was wrapped in leather for Griggs's comfort, but the business end was pure evil, designed not just to punish, but to destroy. "This here," Griggs announced, holding up that instrument of torture for all to see, "is what happens to uppity niggers who forget their place. 800 lashes, 1 for every $1 that boy's worth, plus interest for the disrespect. 800 lashes. The number hit the crowd like a physical blow. Most men died after 50. 100 was unheard of. But 800, that wasn't punishment. That was murder drawn out slow, designed to break not just Madison's body, but the spirit of every soul forced to watch. "Strip him," Griggs commanded. The white men tore the shirt from Madison's back, exposing the broad shoulders that had carried so much weight, so much hope, so much quiet strength. His skin was the color of rich earth after rain, unmarked except for the small scars that came from a lifetime of hard labor. It was beautiful, that back, and Griggs was about to turn it into a road map of agony. They pressed Madison against the post and chained his wrists to the iron rings that had held thousands before him. His face was turned toward his people, and even now, even knowing what was coming, his eyes held no fear, only sorrow, not for himself, but for what they would be forced to witness. Little Ruby was in that crowd, clutching her mama's skirt, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that marks a child's soul forever. Madison found her face in the sea of brown skin and sent her a look that said everything his voice couldn't. "This ain't your fault, child. You worth every lash I'm about to take." Griggs took his position behind the post, that barbed wire whip coiled in his hand like a metal serpent. The first white men to own our ancestors probably looked just like him in that moment, drunk on power, high on cruelty, convinced that their skin color gave them the right to turn human beings into broken meat. "Let this be a lesson," Griggs called out, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "To every nigger who thinks about raising his hand or his voice to a white man, this is what defiance gets you." He drew back the whip, muscles tensing for the first blow. And in that moment before the metal bit into flesh, time seemed to slow like molasses in winter. The Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks stopped swaying. The very air held its breath. Even the sun seemed to dim, like heaven itself was turning away from what was about to happen. Lord God Almighty, what I'm about to tell you now, ain't no words in human language for pain that deep. Ain't no way to describe what barbed wire does to human flesh when it's wielded by hate and twisted by fury. But I'm gonna try, 'cause forgetting this story is the same as letting Madison's suffering mean nothing. The first lash came down like judgment from an angry god, and the sound it made hitting Madison's back was like nothing nobody in that yard had ever heard. Not the clean crack of leather whips they knew too well, but something wet and tearing, like the very fabric of the world splitting apart. 3 lines of barbed wire bit into the muscles of Madison's shoulders, and where they touched, they didn't just mark, they grabbed, caught on his skin and held. tearing flesh away in strips when Griggs pulled back for the second blow. Madison's body jerked against the chains, every muscle going rigid, but no sound passed his lips. Not yet. In that first moment of agony, he found something deep inside himself, deeper than pain, deeper than fear, deeper even than the will to live. He found silence. "One!" Griggs called out, his voice thick with pleasure that made the watching crowd feel sick to their stomachs. The second lash crossed the first, opening new wounds that bled immediately, running down Madison's back in rivers that caught the afternoon sunlight and turned it red. The barbs caught in the torn flesh of the first strike, ripping it wider, deeper. "Two!" Ruby started crying, her small voice keening like a bird with a broken wing. Her mama tried to cover the child's eyes, but Ruby pushed the hands away. If Madison could bear this, she would bear witness. She owed him that much. By the 10th lash, Madison's back looked like raw meat hung in a butcher's shop. The barbed wire had torn through skin, through fat, into the muscle beneath. Blood was flowing so freely it pooled in the dust beneath his feet, turning the earth into red mud. By the 20th lash, he finally made his first sound. Not a scream, but something deeper, more primal. A groan that came from the very center of his being, like the earth itself was crying out in pain. "You can stop this anytime you want, boy," Griggs called out, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. "Just admit you struck me. Beg forgiveness. Promise to know your place from now on." Madison raised his head with effort that must have cost him everything, found Griggs's eyes and said just 2 words. Quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Go ahead." That's when Griggs truly lost his mind. The whip came down faster now, harder, with all the fury of a man who'd been denied the satisfaction of breaking his victim's spirit. 25, 30, 40 lashes, each one tearing new flesh, opening new wounds. At 50 lashes, most men would have been unconscious. At 75, they would have been dead. But Madison hung on that post like something more than human, like he was held up by the prayers of every ancestor who'd suffered before him, by the love of every soul in that yard, by a will so strong even his body couldn't kill it. The crowd had started swaying, rocking back and forth like trees in a storm. They couldn't sing, Griggs had forbidden it, but they could move, and their movement carried all the power of a spiritual made flesh. Old Jeremiah's eyes were closed, his lips moving in silent prayer, calling on powers older than Christianity, older than slavery, older than America itself. At 100 lashes, Madison's consciousness started sliding in and out like waves on a beach. His knees buckled, and only the chains around his wrists held him upright. His back was no longer recognizable as human skin. It was just meat and bone and flowing blood. But still, he lived. Still, he breathed. Griggs was sweating now, his arm tired from the constant motion, his expensive shirt soaked through with perspiration and spattered with Madison's blood. But he was drunk on power, high on the feeling of absolute control over another human being's suffering. 150, he called out, his voice hoarse but triumphant. That's when Madison raised his head one more time and spoke again, his voice so quiet that only the front row of slaves could hear him. But what he said passed through that crowd like electricity, whispered from mouth to mouth until every soul knew what their brother had spoken in the face of torture. "My name is Madison. Not boy, not nigger, Madison." And somehow, in that declaration of his own humanity while hanging like butchered meat from a whipping post, Madison claimed a victory that all the barbed wire in creation couldn't take away from him. Griggs heard those whispers spreading through the crowd, and he knew what they meant. This wasn't working. The slave was supposed to be broken by now, supposed to be begging, supposed to be nothing more than an animal crying for mercy. But Madison was still a man, still strong, still defiant, and that scared Overseer Griggs more than anything he'd ever felt in his life. Suffering so bad. What came after that 200th lash ain't something the mind wants to hold, but hold it we must. 'Cause this is the story of how a man became a legend, how flesh became spirit, how one soul's refusal to break became the foundation for every rebellion that followed. By 200 lashes, Madison's back was no longer a back. It was a canyon of torn flesh, white bone showing through in places where the barbed wire had cut all the way to his spine. The post itself was slicked with blood, and the ground beneath him had turned into red mud that squelched with every drop that fell. The white ladies on the porch had long since retreated into the house, their delicate sensibilities overcome by the sight of what their menfolk considered justice. But the white men stayed, some of them looking sick but unable to look away, others nodding approval like they was watching the breaking of a particularly stubborn horse. Master Beauregard himself had gone quiet, his face pale as milk, and more than once he opened his mouth like he was gonna call an end to it. But Griggs had the bit in his teeth now, and there was no stopping him short of the full 800. In the crowd of slaves, something was happening that ain't never happened before on that plantation. They was finding their voice, not in words, 'cause words would have meant death for all of them, but in something deeper. Old Jeremiah had started swaying again, and this time his movement carried power that crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. The African women began a slow, rhythmic clapping, soft at first, barely audible, but growing stronger with each passing minute. The men picked it up, then the children, until the whole crowd was moving to a rhythm older than slavery, older than memory, older than pain. Griggs noticed it too, the way the energy was shifting in the yard. What had started as a demonstration of white power was becoming something else entirely. A ceremony, a ritual, a calling up of spirits that didn't bow down to no white man's whip. "Stop that," he screamed, his voice cracking like a boy's. "Stop that devil music or I'll whip every last one of you." But the rhythm didn't stop, couldn't stop. It was coming from someplace deeper than fear, someplace that knew this moment was bigger than just one man's suffering. At 300 lashes, Madison passed out for the first time, his body finally giving in to trauma that should have killed him hours ago. His head dropped forward, and his full weight hung from the chains around his wrists. Griggs was breathing hard, sweat streaming down his face, his shirt plastered to his body. The whip felt heavy in his hands, and his arm was starting to cramp from the constant motion. But he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Not when he was so close to breaking the most dangerous slave he'd ever encountered. "Wake him up," he commanded. One of the white men threw a bucket of salt water on Madison's torn back, and the pain of it brought him screaming back to consciousness. The sound that came from his throat was no longer human. It was the cry of every tortured soul that had ever lived, the voice of suffering itself given form. But when his eyes opened, they still held fire. At 400 lashes, the barbed wire whip was starting to break apart from the constant use and the resistance of tearing flesh. Pieces of Madison's skin hung from the barbs like grotesque decorations, and Griggs had to stop several times to clean the weapon of the meat that clogged it. "Just beg," he panted, his own body starting to fail from the exertion. "Just say you're sorry. Just admit what you've done." Madison raised his head with effort that seemed impossible. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his face gray with shock and blood loss, but his voice came clear as a bell. "I ain't done nothing wrong." That's when Griggs truly snapped. The whip came down with renewed fury, faster than before, beyond counting now. 450, 500, 550, 600 lashes, each one tearing away more of Madison's humanity, more of his flesh, more of his life. But somehow, impossibly, he still breathed. The crowd was no longer silent. The rhythm had become a chant, wordless but powerful, and even the threat of death couldn't stop it now. They was witnessing something sacred, the birth of a martyr, the making of a saint, the transformation of a man into a symbol that would outlive every one of them. Little Ruby had stopped crying. Her face was set in lines too hard for a child's features, and her small hands were clenched into fists. She was learning something in that yard that would shape the rest of her life, that some things are worth any price, that dignity cannot be whipped out of a person, that love is stronger than hate. At 700 lashes, Madison's body was held upright only by the chains and the wooden post. Most of his back was gone, torn away strip by strip, and white bone gleamed through the red ruin of his flesh. His breathing was shallow, labored, but still steady, still defiant. Griggs was stumbling now, exhaustion and something else. Horror at what he'd created, making his movements clumsy. The whip felt like it weighed 100 pounds in his hands, and his shoulders screamed with every swing. 750, he gasped out, the number meaningless now in the face of what he'd done. But Madison was still alive, still conscious, still looking at his people with eyes that said, "Don't let them break you. Don't let this be for nothing." Remember, at 775 lashes, something changed in the very air of that place. The Spanish moss stopped swaying. The birds fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And in that supernatural quiet, Madison spoke one last time, his voice carrying impossible strength for a man who should have been dead hours ago. "Tell my mama I lived, free, for 30 seconds." Then his head dropped forward, and Overseer Griggs delivered the 800th lash to a man who no longer felt it. But Madison's heart still beat, his chest still rose and fell. And in that impossible survival, every soul in that yard knew they had witnessed something that would echo through generations. The day a slave became something more than human, something that no whip could ever truly kill. Lord of Glory, what happened next ain't written in no white man's history book, ain't carved on no monument in town squares, but it's written in the blood and bone of every descendant who carries the memory, written in the very soil where Madison's life leaked out drop by precious drop. When them 800 lashes was finished, when Overseer Griggs finally let that cursed whip fall from his trembling hands, Madison hung from that post like meat in a smokehouse. His breathing was so shallow you had to put your ear close to his chest to hear it, and his pulse fluttered weak as a dying bird's wing. The white men cut him down rough, letting his body drop into the mud made from his own blood. He hit the ground like a sack of grain. No strength left to break his fall. No awareness left to feel the pain of landing hard on wounds that went clear to the bone. "Drag him behind the quarters," Griggs commanded, his voice hoarse from screaming orders and his face pale as cotton. "Let him die where the other animals can see what happens to uppity niggers." But even as the words left his mouth, Griggs was looking at Madison's still form with something that might have been fear. In all his years of breaking slaves, he'd never seen anything like what just happened. 800 lashes should have killed any man 5 times over, but Madison's chest still rose and fell, still fought for every breath. 2 field hands grabbed Madison under his arms, trying to be gentle despite the white men watching. His head lolled back, and blood ran from his mouth where he'd bitten through his tongue to keep from screaming. But his eyes, Lord have mercy, his eyes was still open, still aware, still holding that fire that all the barbed wire in creation couldn't put out. They carried him past the slave quarters, past the cookhouse, past the well where he'd drawn water just yesterday like any other day. But nothing was ordinary now. Nothing would ever be ordinary again. Behind the quarters, in a little grove of magnolia trees where the white folks couldn't see, they laid Madison down on his belly in the soft grass. The women came running, his mama Althea first among them, her face a mask of anguish and determination that would have scared the devil himself. "Get me clean water," she commanded, taking charge like she was born to heal instead of pick cotton. "Get me moss from them cypress trees by the swamp. Get me comfrey root and chamomile and every healing herb the Lord saw fit to grow in this cursed ground." Old Jeremiah was there too, his weathered hands shaking as he looked at what remained of Madison's back. In 60 years of slavery, through whippings and brandings and every cruelty human minds could devise, he'd never seen destruction like this. "Child," he whispered to Althea, "I don't know if even the ancestors can bring him back from this far." But Althea's eyes blazed with a fire that matched her son's. "Then we gonna call on more than the ancestors. We gonna call on every power that ever loved a suffering soul, every spirit that ever stood against injustice, every force in heaven and earth that remembers what it means to be human." And so began the longest night in the history of that plantation. The women worked by moonlight and candle flame. cleaning wounds so deep you could see Madison's ribs through the torn meat of his back. They packed the deepest cuts with moss and spider webs to stop the bleeding, covered the torn flesh with poultices made from plants that carried healing power older than medicine. Little Ruby was there too, her small hands steady as she helped tear cloth for bandages. She wouldn't leave, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't eat. Just sat by Madison's head and whispered prayers she was too young to know, words that came from some deep place in her soul. "Don't you die," she told him, her voice fierce as any conjure woman's. "Don't you let them win. Don't you leave me in this world without somebody who knows my name means something." All through the night, Madison drifted between this world and the next. Sometimes his breathing would slow until they thought he was gone. Then suddenly his chest would rise deep and strong like he was drawing power from the very air. Sometimes he would mutter words in languages none of them recognized. African words maybe, or the tongue of spirits, or just the sound of a soul refusing to let go. Althea sang to him, soft and low, the same lullabies she'd sung when he was a baby. But now the words carried different meaning, different power. They wasn't just songs no more. They was incantations, prayers made melody, love given voice in the darkness. "Swing low, sweet chariot," she sang, her hands gentle on his fevered forehead. "Coming for to carry me home. If you get there before I do, tell all my friends I'm coming too." And somewhere in the space between those words and the rhythm of her voice, something shifted. Madison's breathing got stronger, his pulse steadied. The bleeding slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. By morning, when the rooster crowed and the white folks expected to find a corpse, Madison was still alive. Broken, torn, changed forever, but alive. Mercy me. The healing that followed ain't something you could explain to folks who ain't never seen the power of love made manifest in human hands. For 3 weeks, Madison lay in that grove of magnolia trees, hovering between life and death like a soul caught in the crossroads between worlds. The plantation kept running. Cotton still needed picking, meals still needed cooking, Master Beauregard's comfort still needed tending. But every spare moment, every break from labor, every stolen hour after the white folks went to bed, the quarters emptied out toward that grove where their brother fought for his life. Althea barely left his side. She'd work in the fields all day with her hands bleeding from the cotton bolls, then spend her nights cleaning Madison's wounds and changing his bandages. The other women brought her food, water, clean cloth, whatever healing plants they could gather without raising suspicion. Old Jeremiah came every evening with new mixtures of roots and herbs. Some nights he'd just sit with Madison, humming old songs and letting his weathered hands rest on the young man's head. Other nights he'd prepare tinctures that smelled of earth and growing things. Medicines that carried power passed down from root doctor to root doctor since before the ships brought their people to this shore. "This boy's got protection," Jeremiah told Althea one night as they watched Madison's chest rise and fall. "Something's watching over him. Somebody wants him to live." By the second week, the worst of the wounds had started to close. Not healing clean. They'd leave scars thick as rope that would mark Madison for the rest of his life, but closing enough to keep death from seeping in through his back. By the third week, he was conscious more than not, able to take broth and speak a few words at a time. His voice was hoarse, damaged from the screaming he'd held back, but the fire in his eyes was stronger than ever. Little Ruby visited him every day, sitting cross-legged in the grass and telling him everything that happened on the plantation. How Overseer Griggs walked different now, looking over his shoulder like he expected retribution to come creeping up behind him. How the other slaves worked quieter but with more purpose, like they was planning something. How the very air seemed charged with change. "They scared," Ruby told him one afternoon, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. "The white folks scared of what they seen in you. Scared they can't break us no matter how hard they try." Madison tried to smile, but the movement pulled at the scars around his mouth. "Good," he whispered. "Fear's the beginning of respect, and respect's the beginning of freedom." It was during the 4th week, when Madison was finally strong enough to sit up for short periods, that the vision came to him. He was dozing in the afternoon heat, the pain medication old Jeremiah had given him making his mind drift like a boat on still water. Suddenly, the air around him shimmered, and he found himself standing not in the magnolia grove, but in a vast field under a sky darker than midnight. Ancient figures moved through that field, men and women whose skin held the deep richness of Mother Africa, whose eyes burned with fires that slavery couldn't extinguish. Some wore the scars of whips and chains, others bore the marks of branding irons and auction blocks, but all of them walked tall, walked proud, walked free. "Son," said a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself, "you got work to do." Madison turned and saw an old woman whose face held the wisdom of centuries. She was dressed in cloth that flowed like water, and around her neck hung charms made of bone and metal and stone. "Grandmother," he said, though he'd never seen her before in his life. "I'm broken. I can barely stand. Broken." The old woman laughed, and the sound was like wind chimes made of silver. "Child, you just been remade, forged in fire and pain until you harder than any metal white man ever worked. You ain't broken, you tempered." She walked closer, and Madison could smell the sweetness of African flowers, the richness of red soil, the salt of tears shed across an ocean. "That whip didn't destroy you," she continued. "It marked you. Every scar on your back is a mark of power, every wound a symbol of strength. You survived what was meant to kill you, and now you got to decide what to do with the gift of extra days." "What am I supposed to do?" Madison asked. The old woman smiled, and her smile was terrible and beautiful at the same time. "What your people always done, child. You gonna resist. But this time, you gonna resist with purpose. You gonna resist with power. You gonna resist until the very foundations of this evil system shake." Around them, the other figures began to move closer, and Madison recognized some of their faces from stories told in the quarters. Rebels who'd led uprisings, runaways who'd guided others to freedom, conjure women who'd used spiritual power to protect their people. "We've been waiting for you," said a tall man whose back bore scars similar to Madison's. "Been waiting for someone strong enough to carry what we got to give." They reached out their hands toward Madison, and when their fingers touched his skin, power flowed into him like lightning made liquid. Not the power to fly or turn invisible or any such magical nonsense, but something deeper, something real. The power to endure anything, the power to inspire others, the power to turn suffering into strength, and strength into action. When Madison woke from the vision, the sun was setting and his mother was sitting beside him with worry creasing her features. "Son," Althea said softly, "you been talking in your sleep, talking to folks who ain't there." Madison looked at his hands, and for just a moment he could swear he saw a faint glow around his fingers. The pain in his back was still there, but it felt different now. Not like a burden, but like a reminder of what he'd survived, what he'd overcome. "Mama," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the whipping, "I got work to do. Listen here, children, 'cause what I'm about to tell you next is the night that changed everything. Not just for Madison, not just for that plantation, but for every soul who'd ever worn chains and dreamed of freedom. It was a month after the whipping, on a night when the moon hung full and silver as a conjure woman's mirror. Madison was finally strong enough to walk short distances, though every step pulled at the thick scars crisscrossing his back like a road map of pain. He'd been having the dreams every night since his vision, dreams where the ancestors spoke to him, where ancient powers whispered secrets in languages older than English, where the very earth beneath the plantation trembled with barely contained energy. This particular night felt different from the others. The air was thick with moisture from the nearby swamp, and every cricket and tree frog seemed to be singing the same song, harmonizing in a way that made the hair on Madison's neck stand up. He couldn't sleep. The scars itched like fire ants under his skin, and his mind was too full of voices and visions to find rest. So he rose from his pallet in the magnolia grove, moving careful so as not to wake his mother, and walked toward the old cemetery where slaves had been buried for more generations than anyone could count. The graveyard was nothing much to look at. just wooden markers carved with names and dates. Some graves marked only with bottles and shells, the way their African ancestors had done. But tonight, as Madison approached through the Spanish moss and creeping vines, the place seemed to pulse with life. He knelt beside a grave he'd visited before, his grandmother's resting place, though she'd died before he was born. The marker read simply, Zara, beloved mother, gone home 1820. But old Jeremiah had told him stories about her power with roots and herbs, her ability to see spirits, her reputation as a woman who could talk to the dead. Grandmother, Madison whispered, pressing his palms flat against the earth above her bones. I need guidance. I need to know what comes next. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The ground beneath his hands grew warm, then hot, and suddenly Madison wasn't kneeling in a slave cemetery in South Carolina anymore. He was standing in the same endless field from his previous vision, but this time he wasn't alone. Hundreds of figures surrounded him. Men, women, and children who died in chains but whose spirits had never been enslaved. They moved like wind through tall grass, their forms shifting between solid flesh and dancing light. His grandmother Zara stood before him, but she looked different than the old woman in his earlier vision. Now she appeared as she must have in life, tall and proud, with intricate patterns scarred into her cheeks and silver rings adorning her fingers. Child, she said, her voice carrying the musical quality of the African languages she'd spoken before the ships took her across the water. You ready to receive what we've been keeping for you? Madison nodded, though fear and anticipation warred in his chest. Zara raised her hands and the other spirits began to move in a circle around them. Their mouths opened in song, not spirituals or work songs, but something older, something that made the very air vibrate with power. This plantation, Zara said as her people sang, sits on ground soaked with more than just your blood. Every tear, every drop of sweat, every life lost to whip and rope and broken heart. It all went into the earth, and earth remembers everything. She knelt and scooped up a handful of the dark soil. When she opened her palm, the dirt glowed like coals in a forge. Suffering ain't just destruction, grandson. Sometimes it's creation. Sometimes pain plants seeds that grow into power nobody can imagine. The glowing earth in her palm began to rise, swirling around Madison like a small tornado made of light and memory. Where it touched his scars, they burned. Not with hurt, but with recognition, like old friends greeting each other. Every lash you took, Zara continued, her voice growing stronger. Every moment you chose silence over surrender. Every breath you drew when death was begging you to quit. All of that fed this power we're giving you now. The whirlwind of glowing earth settled into Madison's skin, sinking through his flesh and into his bones, until he could feel it pulsing in time with his heartbeat. It was warm and terrible and beautiful all at once. What is it? He asked, though part of him already knew. Justice, said a dozen voices in unison. Patience made manifest, righteous anger given form. Around them the spirits began to fade back into the darkness, but their song continued, growing softer but no less powerful. The man who broke you, Zara said as her own form started to dissolve. He gonna pay for every drop of blood he spilled, every tear he caused, every night he stole from children who should have been sleeping safe instead of cowering in fear. How? Madison asked. His grandmother's smile was the last thing to disappear, white teeth gleaming in the spirit light. With the very weapon he used against you, child. With the barbed wire whip that was meant to destroy you but instead marked you as chosen. You gonna take that instrument of torture and turn it into an instrument of justice. Madison woke in the cemetery with dirt under his fingernails and power humming in his veins like electricity before a storm. The moon was setting, and dawn was breaking pink and gold over the plantation. But everything looked different now. The quarters where his people lived didn't just look like poverty and oppression anymore. They looked like a fortress, a place where warriors had been forged in the fires of suffering. The fields where they labored didn't just represent exploitation. They represented the strength of backs that couldn't be broken, hands that created beauty even in bondage. And the big house. where Master Beauregard slept in comfort built on stolen lives. That looked different too. It looked vulnerable, temporary, like something that could be changed if the right kind of pressure was applied in the right way. Madison stood slowly, every muscle in his body singing with new purpose. The scars on his back no longer felt like marks of shame. They felt like a coat of armor, protection earned through trial by fire. Overseer Griggs was still sleeping in his cabin behind the big house, probably dreaming of the next slave he could torment, the next spirit he could try to break. But his sleeping days were numbered now. Madison had work to do, and he finally understood exactly what that work was going to be. The reckoning was coming, and it was going to be terrible and beautiful and absolutely unstoppable. Sweet Jesus. When Madison walked back into them cotton fields 6 weeks after 800 lashes should have killed him, every soul on that plantation felt the earth shift beneath their feet. The morning mist clung to the rows like spirits refusing to leave, and the very air seemed to hold its breath as he took his place among the workers. His back was a testament to survival. Thick scars crisscrossed like rope under his shirt, raised welts that told the story of every lash, every moment he'd chosen to endure rather than surrender. But it was his eyes that made folks step aside as he passed. They wasn't the same eyes that had looked at little Ruby with gentle protection 6 weeks ago. These were eyes that had seen the other side of death and chosen to come back. Eyes that had spoken with ancestors and been given purpose. Eyes that carried justice in them like coals carry fire. "Lord have mercy," whispered Sarah, one of the field hands, as Madison bent to fill his cotton sack. That man's been touched by something powerful. And she was right. Every movement Madison made was deliberate, purposeful, like he was conserving energy for something specific. When he picked cotton, his hands moved with the same steady rhythm they always had. But there was something different in the way he handled the plants. Gentle, respectful, like he was asking forgiveness from the earth for what was about to happen on its surface. Overseer Griggs watched from his horse, that same animal cruelty in his pale eyes. But something else too now, something that might have been unease. He'd expected Madison to come back broken, humbled, grateful just to be alive. Instead, the slave moved through the field like a man with secrets, like a man with plans. "Boy," Griggs called out, spurring his horse closer. "You remember what happens to uppity niggers who forget their place?" Madison straightened slowly, turned to face the overseer, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the two men looked at each other across a divide deeper than skin color, deeper than slavery, deeper than hate itself. "Yes, sir," Madison said quietly. "I remember everything." But the way he said it, soft and certain and carrying weight like thunder in distant hills, made Griggs's hand move instinctively toward the whip coiled at his saddle. The same barbed wire whip that had torn Madison's back to ribbons, that should have ended this conversation before it ever began. "Good," Griggs said, but his voice cracked just a little. "Long as we understand each other." Madison nodded respectfully, bent back to his work, and continued picking cotton like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and every person in that field could feel it rolling off him like heat from summer pavement. That evening, after the work bell rang and the field hands trudged back toward the quarters, Madison lingered. He moved through the cotton rows as the sun set, his hands trailing along the plants, his lips moving in what looked like prayer, but sounded like something older. Little Ruby found him there, sitting cross-legged in the dirt between the cotton stalks, his eyes closed and his scarred hands resting on the earth. "Uncle Madison?" she whispered, afraid to disturb whatever sacred thing was happening but too curious to walk away. His eyes opened, and when he smiled at her, she saw something in his face that made her young heart leap with hope and terror both. "Come here, child," he said softly. "Sit with me a minute." She settled beside him in the dirt, her small hand finding his larger one. His skin was warm, warmer than the evening air, like he was burning with fever that didn't hurt. "What you doing out here?" she asked. "Listening," Madison replied. "The earth's got things to tell me, important things." Ruby looked around at the cotton plants swaying in the evening breeze, heard the night sounds starting up from the swamp, felt the solid ground beneath her legs. "What's it saying?" Madison was quiet for a long moment. His head tilted like he was hearing music she couldn't catch. "It's saying that every drop of blood spilled on this land, every tear cried into this soil, every prayer whispered over these fields, none of it was wasted. It all went somewhere, built up like water behind a dam, waiting for the right moment to break free." He squeezed her hand gently, and she felt that same warmth flowing from his fingers into hers. "It's saying that change is coming, Ruby. Real change. The kind that can't be stopped with whips or chains or fear." "When?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Madison turned to look toward the overseer's cabin, where lamplight flickered in the windows and Griggs was probably cleaning his weapons or counting his money or planning new torments for tomorrow. "Soon," he said. "Very soon." Over the following days, Madison worked in the fields with the same quiet efficiency he'd always shown. But the other slaves began to notice small things. How the cotton seemed to grow faster in the rows he tended. How the sun felt less brutal when he was working nearby. How the water from the well tasted sweeter when he'd drawn it. Old Jeremiah pulled him aside one evening as the workers returned to the quarters. "Son," the root doctor said, his ancient eyes studying Madison's face like he was reading signs written in a foreign language. "Something's different about you since the whipping. Something powerful." Madison nodded. There was no point in denying what every person with spiritual sight could see. "The ancestors spoke to me," he said simply. "Gave me work to do." "What kind of work?" Madison looked toward the big house where Master Beauregard was taking his evening brandy on the porch, then toward the overseer's cabin where Griggs was probably sharpening his knives. "Justice work," he said. "The kind that's been building up for generations, waiting for the right hands to shape it." Old Jeremiah nodded slowly. He'd seen signs and portents all his life, but nothing like the energy that rolled off Madison in waves. "You gonna need help," the old man said. "This kind of work, it ain't meant to be done alone." "I know," Madison replied. "But it's got to start with one man, one choice, one moment when somebody says enough and means it all the way down to their bones." That night, Madison lay on his pallet in the quarters and felt the scars on his back burning with purpose. Not painful burning, purposeful burning, like metal being heated in a forge before it's shaped into something useful. Through the thin walls, he could hear the other slaves settling into sleep, their breathing deep and steady, their dreams probably filled with freedom and plenty and safety for their children. Good dreams, dreams worth fighting for. But Madison's dreams were different now. In his dreams, he saw Griggs's face contorted with terror, saw the barbed wire whip turned from instrument of torture into tool of justice, saw the plantation burning not with destructive fire, but with the light of truth finally blazing free. And in his dreams, he heard his grandmother's voice again, soft and strong and absolutely certain. "Soon, child. Very soon. Suffering so bad." The night it all began to turn was darker than the inside of a coffin, with clouds covering the moon like death's own blanket and the air thick enough to choke on. Madison had been waiting 3 weeks since his return to the fields, watching, learning, letting his strength build, while Griggs grew more comfortable with the idea that his 800 lashes had finally broken the most dangerous slave on the plantation. But Madison wasn't broken. He was tempered, forged in fire and pain until he was harder than any steel the white man had ever worked. And tonight, that tempering was about to be put to the test. It was past midnight when Madison rose from his pallet, moving silent as a ghost through the quarters where his people slept. The scars on his back pulled and ached, but the pain was different now. Not the sharp agony of fresh wounds, but the deep, constant reminder of purpose that burned in his flesh like brands marking him as chosen. He'd been watching Griggs for weeks, learning his habits, studying his weaknesses. The overseer had grown careless since the whipping, confident that Madison's spirit was broken, that the example had been set and would keep the other slaves in line for years to come. Every night, Griggs followed the same routine. He'd drink whiskey on his cabin porch until the bottle was half empty, then stumble inside to count his money and clean his weapons before falling into drunken sleep. Tonight was no different, except for one small detail that Griggs couldn't have known. Tonight, Madison was watching. From the shadows of the magnolia trees, Madison observed as Griggs finished his bottle and lurched to his feet. The overseer was singing something under his breath, a crude song about breaking horses and training dogs and keeping property in line. The words made Madison's scars burn hotter, but he stayed perfectly still, perfectly patient. The ancestors had taught him patience during those long nights of recovery. Patience and purpose, and the understanding that justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it's justice perfected. Griggs disappeared into his cabin, and Madison heard the familiar sounds of the nightly ritual. The clink of coins being counted, the rasp of steel being sharpened, the creak of bed ropes as a man who had tortured people for pleasure settled in for peaceful sleep. Madison waited another hour, until Griggs's snores echoed through the thin cabin walls, before he moved. He crossed the yard between the quarters and the overseer's cabin like a shadow given form, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. The scars on his back seemed to guide him, pulling him forward with invisible threads toward the confrontation that had been building since the moment 800 lashes failed to kill him. At the cabin door, Madison paused, not from fear. Fear had been burned out of him weeks ago, but from the weight of what he was about to do. This wasn't just revenge. This was the moment when a slave stopped being property and became a force of nature. The door wasn't locked. Why would it be? Who on a slave plantation would dare to threaten the overseer? What piece of property would be foolish enough to challenge the man who held the power of life and death over every black soul for miles around? Madison pushed the door open slow and stepped inside. The cabin was small and cramped, furnished with the kind of rough comfort that came from a lifetime of exploiting other people's labor. Griggs's clothes hung on pegs along the wall. His money lay scattered across a wooden table, and his weapons, including the barbed-wire whip, rested within easy reach of his bed. The overseer lay on his back, mouth open, snoring like a hog wallowing in mud. In sleep, his face looked almost innocent, almost human, almost. But Madison remembered little Ruby pressed against the shed wall, remembered the feel of barbed wire tearing through his flesh, remembered the sound of his own people weeping as they were forced to watch his destruction, and any trace of mercy died in his chest like a flame snuffed out. He moved to the table where Griggs's weapons lay waiting, the barbed wire whip coiled there like a sleeping serpent, 3 strands of twisted metal that had drunk more black blood than a vampire. Madison's hand hovered over it for a moment, and he could swear he felt it humming with malevolent energy. Then his fingers closed around the leather handle, and power flowed through him like lightning. This was the moment the ancestors had prepared him for. This was the purpose that had kept him alive through 800 lashes and weeks of agony. This was justice wearing flesh and blood and righteous anger. The whip felt different in his hands than it had in Griggs's. In the overseer's grip, it had been an instrument of cruelty, designed to break spirits and crush hope. But in Madison's hands, it became something else entirely. A tool of balance, a means of restoring what had been taken, a way of speaking truth in a language that men like Griggs could finally understand. Madison turned toward the bed where his tormentor slept, and for just a moment, time seemed to slow like molasses in winter. He could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the power of every ancestor who had ever suffered flowing through his veins, could sense the moment when the wheel of justice finally began to turn. Griggs's eyes opened. For a heartbeat, confusion clouded the overseer's features as sleep gave way to wakefulness, and he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. A slave, in his cabin, holding his whip. Then understanding dawned, and with it terror so pure and absolute that Griggs's face went white as cotton in moonlight. "Madison," he whispered, his voice cracking like a boy's. "What? What are you doing here?" Madison didn't answer with words. Instead, he let the whip uncoil in his hands, the barbed wire catching the lamplight and throwing twisted shadows on the cabin walls. The sound it made, metal scraping against metal, was like the hiss of some ancient serpent awakening from long sleep. "Please," Griggs whispered, scrambling backward against his pillow, his hands held up in futile protection. "I was just doing my job, just keeping order." You understand that, don't you? You understand. I understand, Madison said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 800 lashes and 800 reasons for what was about to happen. I understand everything now. He raised the whip, and in that moment, Griggs finally learned what it felt like to be powerless, finally understood what it meant to face inevitable pain with no hope of mercy, no chance of escape, no possibility that begging would make any difference. 800, Madison said, his voice steady as bedrock. You remember that number, don't you? And then, with all the patience the ancestors had taught him, all the precision born from suffering, all the justice that had been building in his soul like pressure in a steam engine, Madison brought the barbed wire whip down for the first time. But this time, he was the one wielding it. This time, justice had a name and a face and scars that told the story of survival. This time, the wheel had turned. Lord God Almighty. What happened in that cabin ain't something you write down in church records or carve on tombstones. But it's something that needs to be remembered, because it was the night when the natural order of things got turned upside down and inside out, when the oppressed became the oppressor, and justice put on flesh and blood, and settled old debts with interest. That first lash across Griggs's chest opened him up like overripe fruit, the barbed wire catching on his nightshirt and tearing it away in bloody strips. The man who had delivered 800 lashes without blinking screamed at the first touch of his own medicine, a sound so high and desperate it might have been a pig being slaughtered. One, Madison said calmly, his voice carrying none of the fury or hatred that Griggs had shown. This wasn't personal anymore. This was mathematical. This was accounting. This was the universe balancing its books. Stop, please, I'm sorry, Griggs babbled, blood already streaming down his pale chest. But Madison had heard those same pleas from his own lips weeks ago, had seen how much mercy they bought from the man who now cowered before him. The second lash wrapped around Griggs's torso like a deadly embrace, and where it touched, it left its mark in lines of fire and torn flesh. The overseer tried to roll away, tried to escape, but Madison was patient as death itself. He simply waited for Griggs to exhaust himself, then delivered the third stroke with the precision of a surgeon. Please, Griggs sobbed, his face streaming with tears and snot and terror. I got money. I can pay you. I can help you escape, anything you want. But Madison wasn't interested in money or escape or any of the small bargains that desperate men try to make when they finally meet their reckoning. He was interested in justice, pure and simple and terrible in its completeness. By the 10th lash, Griggs was no longer begging with words. Pain had reduced him to animal sounds, grunts and whimpers and gasps that came from somewhere deeper than language. His skin was opened in a dozen places, blood flowing freely, staining his bed and pooling on the cabin floor. By the 20th lash, Madison had settled into a rhythm as steady as his heartbeat. Each stroke was measured, deliberate, designed to inflict maximum suffering without granting the mercy of unconsciousness. He had learned this rhythm from Griggs himself, had it burned into his memory during 800 lashes of his own. 20, he said softly. 780 to go. That's when Griggs understood. This wasn't just a beating. This wasn't just revenge. This was an exact accounting, lash for lash, pain for pain, terror for terror. Madison intended to give back every single stroke he'd received, with the same precision, the same patience, the same ruthless completeness. You can't, Griggs whispered through lips already swollen from where he'd bitten them to keep from screaming. Nobody could survive. Nobody could. I did, Madison replied, and those two words carried more weight than any sermon, more truth than any philosophy, more power than any law ever written by white men to protect white men. The whip came down again and again and again. Each lash wrapped around Griggs's body like a metal snake, tearing away flesh, exposing muscle, opening wounds that would never properly heal. The overseer's blood mixed with Madison's on the barbed wire, creating a crimson bond between torturer and victim that couldn't be broken by any power on earth. At 50 lashes, Griggs passed out. Madison simply waited, patient as granite, until the man's body dragged him back to consciousness. Then he continued the count. 51. The cabin filled with the smell of blood and fear and something else. Something that might have been justice given physical form. Outside, the night creatures had gone silent, as if all of nature was holding its breath to witness this moment when the wheel of history finally turned. At 100 lashes, Griggs was no longer recognizable as the confident, cruel man who had tormented slaves for 20 years. His body was opened like a book, his flesh hanging in strips, his blood creating abstract patterns on the walls where the whip had flung it. But he was still alive, still conscious, still able to feel every lash as it fell. Madison paused at 125, not from exhaustion or mercy, but to study his work. The man before him was exactly as destroyed as Madison himself had been after the same number of strokes. The symmetry was perfect, the balance exact. "Now you know," Madison said quietly. "Now you understand what it feels like to be property. What it feels like to have no power, no hope, no chance of mercy." Griggs tried to speak, but only blood came from his mouth. His eyes, though, his eyes still held enough awareness to understand what was happening to him, to know that this was only the beginning. 200 more, Madison continued, and you'll be where I was when I first asked myself if I wanted to live or die. 400 more, and you'll understand why I chose to live. 600 more, and you'll know what it means to find power in powerlessness. He raised the whip again, and Griggs made a sound that wasn't quite human anymore. A noise that came from the place where hope goes to die, where the soul realizes that all its bargaining power is gone, where a man finally understands that he's about to receive exactly what he gave to others. 800, Madison said, and his voice was steady as a preacher reading scripture, calm as a judge pronouncing sentence. "That's the number you chose. That's the lesson you taught. That's the price you set for standing up to cruelty." The whip descended again, and Griggs's body jerked like a fish on a hook. But there was nowhere to run now, nowhere to hide, no appeal to higher authority. Madison was the higher authority now. Madison was justice personified. Madison was the answer to every prayer ever whispered by broken souls in the darkness of slave quarters. And he was just getting started. Mercy me. What came after them first 200 lashes ain't something the human mind wants to hold. But hold it we must, 'cause this is the night when Madison of the barbed-wire whip earned his legend. When justice put on flesh and settled accounts that had been overdue for generations. By 250 lashes, Overseer Griggs was no longer the man who had strutted through the plantation with death in his eyes and cruelty in his heart. He was meat and bone and flowing blood, held together by nothing more than Madison's will and the terrible mathematics of perfect revenge. The cabin looked like a slaughterhouse now, blood painting the walls in patterns that told the story of every stroke, every moment of agony, every second of terror that Griggs had inflicted on innocent souls, and was now receiving back with interest. "Please," Griggs whispered through lips split and swollen, his voice no more than a breath. "Kill me, just kill me and be done with it." But Madison shook his head with the patience of a man who had looked death in the face and chosen life, who had felt his own flesh torn from his bones, and decided that survival was the greatest victory of all. "No," Madison said softly. The barbed-wire whip coiled in his hands like a serpent awaiting orders. "You don't get to choose when this ends. You don't get to bargain or negotiate or find an easy way out. You're gonna feel every lash just like I did. You're gonna count every stroke just like I did. You're gonna learn what it means to be property." At 300 lashes, something in Griggs's mind broke. Not his body, that had been breaking since the first stroke, but his spirit, his sense of self, his understanding of who he was in the world. He'd spent 20 years believing that his skin color made him a god among lesser beings, that his position gave him the right to torture and terrorize and destroy. Now he was learning what it felt like to be on the other side of absolute power. Madison continued his work with the steady rhythm of a man sowing seeds, each lash falling exactly where it needed to fall, each stroke calculated to cause maximum pain without granting the mercy of death. He'd learned this terrible precision from Griggs himself, had it burned into his memory during 800 moments of his own destruction. The barbed wire wrapped around the overseer's body like metal ivy, tearing away strips of flesh, exposing bone, creating wounds that would never heal clean even if the man survived, which he wouldn't. Not all of him. The part that had been Griggs the overseer, Griggs the tormentor, Griggs the master of black pain. That part was dying with every lash. At 400 strokes, Madison paused to study his work. The man chained to the post, for he had bound Griggs just as he himself had been bound, was exactly as destroyed as Madison had been at the same point. The symmetry was beautiful in its terrible completeness. "Now you understand," Madison said, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral wisdom, the patience of stones, the inexorable power of justice finally given form. "Now you know what I felt when I thought I was gonna die and couldn't. When pain was the only thing left in the world, and even pain wasn't enough to set me free." Griggs tried to speak, but blood was the only thing that came from his mouth now. His eyes, though. His eyes still held enough awareness to know that he was being transformed, that he was becoming something different, something less than human, something like what he'd tried to make of every slave he'd ever tortured. "But here's the difference between you and me," Madison continued, raising the whip for the 401st stroke. "When I was hanging where you're hanging now, when I was bleeding like you're bleeding now, I never forgot that I was human. Never let the pain make me less than what I was born to be." The whip came down again, and Griggs's body jerked against its bonds like a fish dying on dry land. "You, though," Madison said conversationally, as if discussing the weather or the price of cotton, "you ain't never been human. You've been a beast wearing human skin, a devil walking around in daylight, a creature that fed on suffering and called it natural." At 500 lashes, Griggs no longer looked like anything that had ever been human. His flesh hung in ribbons, his blood pooled in corners of the cabin, and his breathing was so shallow that each breath might be his last. But Madison wasn't finished. Justice demanded completion. The ancestors demanded satisfaction. The 800 lashes he'd received required 800 lashes given in return. 500. Madison announced to the blood-soaked cabin, his voice steady as scripture, calm as a river flowing toward the sea. 300 more to go. Outside, dawn was breaking over the plantation, pink and gold light filtering through the trees, birds beginning their morning songs as if this was just another day in a world where cruelty was currency and suffering was sport. But this wasn't just another day. This was the day when the wheel turned, when the oppressed became the oppressor, when justice put on flesh and settled debts that had been accumulating for generations. Madison raised the whip again, and in that moment, he felt every ancestor who had ever worn chains standing behind him, their hands on his shoulders, their voices whispering encouragement, their spirits lending strength to his arm. Sweet Jesus. The transformation that came after 500 lashes ain't something that can be understood by folks who ain't never seen justice work its terrible magic on evil men. What hung in them chains wasn't Overseer Griggs no more. It was something new, something that had been born from pain and baptized in blood and made into exactly what Griggs had tried to make of every slave he'd ever tortured. At 600 lashes, the thing that had been a man was held together mostly by will. Madison's will, driving the whip, and some darker will that refused to let consciousness slip away, that forced awareness to remain trapped in a body that was more wound than flesh. Madison worked with the patience of eternity, each stroke deliberate as prayer, each lash precisely placed to tear away another piece of the cruelty that had made Griggs who he was. The barbed wire sang through the air like a hymn of justice, and where it touched, it transformed. Not just flesh, and that was easy to transform, but the very essence of power, the understanding of what it meant to be master or slave, human or property. 600, Madison said, his voice carrying the weight of every prayer ever whispered in slave quarters, every tear ever shed over auction blocks. every scream ever stifled in the cotton fields. 200 more. The thing chained to the post tried to speak, but language had left it somewhere around the 400th lash. Now it could only make sounds, wet, desperate noises that came from the place where words go to die, where meaning dissolves into pure sensation. Madison understood those sounds. He'd made them himself weeks ago, when he was the one chained and bleeding and learning what it meant to have no power, no hope, no possibility of mercy. You know what the worst part is? Madison asked conversationally, as if the writhing mass of torn flesh could still comprehend human speech. The worst part ain't the pain. Pain ends eventually, one way or another. The worst part is understanding that you did this to yourself. He raised the whip again, muscles moving with the fluid grace of long practice. Every lash you gave, Madison continued, every soul you broke, every child you terrorized, all of it was you digging your own grave, stroke by stroke, scream by scream. You've been creating this moment for 20 years, building toward this night when everything you gave out would come back to you exact. At 700 lashes, something shifted in the very air of the cabin. The blood on the walls seemed to shimmer, and for a moment, Madison could swear he saw faces in the crimson patterns. The faces of every slave who had ever died under Griggs's whip, every child who had cried themselves to sleep in terror, every woman who had protected her babies from a monster in human skin. They were watching, waiting, witnessing the moment when their pain finally found its answer. The thing that had been Griggs made a sound then that wasn't quite human, and wasn't quite animal. Something caught between the two, something that belonged to neither world. It was the sound of a soul leaving a body while the body still breathed. The noise of a spirit finally understanding what it had done to other spirits. 750, Madison announced, and his voice echoed strangely in the blood-soaked cabin, as if the walls themselves were repeating his words, amplifying them, carrying them out into the darkness where other ears might hear and understand. By now, the thing chained to the post was no longer recognizable as anything that had ever walked upright or claimed dominion over other living beings. It was meat and bone and terror made flesh, held together by nothing more than Madison's will and the terrible mathematics of perfect justice. But it was still conscious, still aware, still able to feel every stroke as it fell. Madison paused at 775, studying what he had created. In the growing dawn light filtering through the cabin windows, the destruction was complete and beautiful and terrible to behold. 25 more, he said softly. 25 more lashes and we'll be even. 25 more strokes and the debt will be paid in full. He coiled the whip in his hands, feeling the weight of the barbed wire, the sticky warmth of blood that wasn't his own, the power that came from being the instrument of justice rather than its victim. But here's what you never understood, Madison continued, his voice growing stronger, more certain, carrying the authority of a man who had died and been reborn, who had looked into the abyss and climbed back out transformed. Even when we're even when the 800 is complete, you still gonna be less than what I am. 'Cause I survived this and stayed human. I endured this and kept my soul. I took 800 lashes and never forgot that I was a child of God. The whip rose one more time, catching the morning light, the barbed wire gleaming like twisted stars. You, though, you gonna be nothing but meat and memory. Nothing but proof that evil eventually devours itself. Nothing but a warning to any other man who thinks he can build himself up by tearing others down. At 799 lashes, Madison stopped. The cabin was silent except for the wet, labored breathing of the thing chained to the post, and the distant sounds of the plantation waking up. Roosters crowing, slaves stirring, the world continuing as if justice hadn't just been served in a small cabin behind the big house. Madison looked at what he had created, what he had transformed, what he had reduced Overseer Griggs to through the simple application of the man's own medicine. It was complete. It was perfect. It was justice made manifest, but he didn't deliver the 800th lash. Instead, he began to wrap the barbed wire whip around the thing that had been Griggs, coil after coil, like he was wrapping a package for shipping to hell itself. Lord God in heaven. What came next ain't something that gets carved on tombstones or written in church records, but it's something that needs to be told, needs to be remembered, needs to be carried forward by every soul who understands that sometimes justice wears a face that looks like vengeance, but carries the heart of righteousness. Madison didn't deliver that 800th lash. Instead, he began the wrapping. Coil by coil, he wound the barbed wire whip around what remained of Overseer Griggs, starting at the ankles and working his way up. The wire bit deep into torn flesh, catching on exposed bone, tightening with each pass until it held the destroyed man like the embrace of death itself. "This is for little Ruby," Madison said softly as the first coil settled around Griggs's legs, who shouldn't have had to learn fear before she learned her letters. Another coil, tighter than the last. "This is for my mama, Althea, who had to sing lullabies to a son she thought was dying from 800 lashes of your cruelty." The wire climbed higher, wrapping around what had been a torso, binding the ruins of a man who had believed his skin color gave him the right to destroy other human beings. "This is for old Jeremiah, who had to mix healing potions for wounds that never should have been made." Coil after coil, each one tighter than the last, each one carrying the weight of a specific injustice, a particular cruelty, a named and numbered sin that demanded accounting. This is for every mother who cried herself to sleep after watching her child sold away. This is for every father who died with a broken heart because he couldn't protect his family. This is for every soul who suffered under your whip and died believing that justice was just a word in the white man's Bible. By the time Madison reached Griggs's chest, the wire was so tight it had become part of the man's flesh, cutting deep channels that wept blood and other fluids. What had been the overseer was now wrapped like a grotesque gift, bound with his own instrument of torture, held together by the very cruelty he had used to tear others apart. "And this," Madison said as he wound the final coils around Griggs's neck, "this is for me. For every moment I chose to live when dying would have been easier. For every breath I took when pain told me to stop breathing. For every time I looked at that whip in your hands and decided that my spirit was stronger than your hate." The last coil settled into place with a sound like a sigh, and suddenly the thing that had been Overseer Griggs was complete, transformed from tormentor into testament, from oppressor into object lesson, from human being into living symbol of what happens when evil finally meets its match. Madison stepped back to admire his work. What hung before him was no longer recognizable as a man. It was art of a sort. Terrible, beautiful, perfect art that spoke truths no sculptor could carve and no painter could capture. It was justice made flesh. It was balance restored. It was the wheel of history finally turning in the right direction. Outside, the plantation was fully awake now. Madison could hear the morning sounds. Work bells ringing, slaves gathering for their daily assignments, overseers calling out orders for another day of cotton and cruelty. But there would be one less overseer today. One less whip cracking over black backs. One less voice raised in hatred and contempt. Madison walked to the cabin door and stepped outside into the golden morning light. The air smelled of magnolia blossoms and Spanish moss, of earth warming under the sun, of hope rising like mist from the swamplands. Behind him, what had been Griggs made one last sound. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something caught between worlds. Something that belonged to neither the living nor the dead, but existed in that terrible space where justice and vengeance meet and become one. Madison didn't look back. His work was finished. He walked through the plantation yard as the sun climbed higher, past the quarters where his people were stirring to life, past the fields where cotton waited to be picked, past the big house where Master Beauregard was probably sipping his morning coffee and wondering why his overseer hadn't come to report for duty. He walked like a man freed from a great burden, like a soul that had finally settled its accounts with the universe, like a warrior returning from a battle that was both won and lost, depending on your perspective. The other slaves saw him coming and knew immediately that something had changed. It was in his walk, in the set of his shoulders, in the way the morning light seemed to follow him like a blessing. "Madison," called Sarah from the field hands. "What happened to you? You look different." Madison smiled, and his smile carried the weight of 800 lashes survived, 800 lashes delivered, and justice finally balanced on scales that had been tipped toward cruelty for too long. "I finished what I started," he said simply. That afternoon, when Master Beauregard sent men to look for his missing overseer, they found what remained of Griggs in the cabin. Or rather, they found what Madison had made of him. A work of art so terrible and perfect that strong men wept to look at it, so complete in its horror that it became beautiful in its own twisted way. They cut the thing down and buried what pieces they could gather, but they never spoke of what they'd seen. How could they? What words existed for such transformation, such justice, such perfect and terrible completion? Within a week, Madison had disappeared. Some said he'd run north, following the drinking gourd to freedom. Others claimed he'd gone south into the swamplands, where he lived like a king among the alligators and the Spanish moss. But the old ones, the ones who understood such things, they knew better. Madison hadn't gone anywhere. Madison had become something else entirely. Not just a man anymore, but a legend, a warning, a promise that justice delayed is not justice denied. Years passed, and the story grew with each telling. Madison of the barbed-wire whip, who took 800 lashes and gave them back with interest. Madison who wrapped his tormentor in the very instrument of torture, who turned oppressor into art, who proved that no evil is so great that it cannot be balanced by righteousness given form. And to this day, when the wind blows through the cotton fields of South Carolina, when the Spanish moss sways in the moonlight, when the old ones gather to tell the stories that must not be forgotten, they speak his name with reverence and terror both. Madison, the man who refused to break, the slave who became justice, the victim who transformed into victory. They say his spirit still walks the land where he suffered and triumphed, protecting those who need protection, delivering justice to those who deserve it, reminding the world that some debts can only be paid in blood and pain and perfect, terrible balance. And when the storytellers finish their tale, when the last word has been spoken, and the audience sits in stunned silence, they always end the same way, with the words that have been passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, from elder to child, from one generation of survivors to the next. The suffering was real, children. The pain was deep. The injustice cut to the bone. But remember this above all else: those who endured it, those who survived it, those who rose up from it stronger than before, their spirits live on in every act of resistance, every moment of courage, every time somebody stands up and says enough to the forces of cruelty and hate. The scars remain, but so does the strength. The wounds heal, but the memory endures. And that memory, that refusal to forget, that determination to honor those who suffered and those who fought back, that memory we carry here in our hearts, in our stories, in the scars of captivity.